American evangelical apologetics have, over the last decade, increasingly aligned itself with Donald Trump and MAGA Christianity. And there's nobody who's probably done more to that end than the apologist Frank Turek. Charlie Kirk co-founded Turning Point USA just over a decade ago. He's a far-right political activist, and he's often doing things with Frank Turek from similar shared promotional events. But I think it's important to understand how radical Charlie Kirk is. And to do that, I just want to give you one anecdote. So you may have heard a couple years ago, a man broke into Nancy and Paul Pelosi's house in the San Francisco area at night. He had a hammer with him. He was looking for Nancy Pelosi, right? He obviously wanted to bludgeon her. She was not home. She was out of the city at the time, but her husband, Paul, who's approximately 80 years old, was home. The man attacked Paul Pelosi. The cops were called, and the cops actually were at the door and filmed the man assaulting Paul Pelosi by hitting him in the head with the hammer. Paul Pelosi's skull was fractured. He was went to the hospital, right? Took a long time to recover, and the man eventually was sentenced to 30 years in prison for attempted murder. How did Charlie Kirk respond to that? Well, he promoted a far-right conspiracy theory that this man and Paul Pelosi were gay lovers and that they had a gay spat. I don't know that he directly referred to the conspiracy theory, but it was popular and circulating at the time, and he made a sort of smirking allusion to it. Arguably even worse, Charlie Kirk, who is known for quote unquote wanting to be tough on crime, nonetheless called for his listeners on his show to bail this attacker of Paul Pelosi out of prison. He wanted to bail him out of prison after he attacked an octogenarian in the head, hitting him with a hammer, the husband of Nancy Pelosi. That's the kind of person that Frank Turek repeatedly does public events with. That gives you a sense of how radical Frank Turek is. Not to belabor the point, but this is just one example, a recent tweet from Turek where he's promoting an event sponsored by himself and a pastor on working with Charlie Kirk or the Charlie Kirk Show to talk about getting out the vote for Donald Trump and MAGA Christianity. So Frank Turek is not put off at all by the fact that Charlie Kirk was making jokes about the attempted murder of Paul Pelosi, and the fact that Charlie Kirk was calling for him to be released, the attacker to be released from prison. Turek recently did an interview with Dr. Owen Anderson, and I did a video about this recently where they're criticizing university education or quote unquote secular university education as bad, as indoctrinational. Here's a second part of that interview, which was also put to Twitter. I'm going to play this and then I'm going to talk about how I actually didn't appreciate the full significance of this at the time with respect to the MAGA agenda.
The universities tend to prey on that rebelliousness of 18 to 25. You're usually kind of rebellious. You want to make your own life apart from your parents. And universities purposely use that to say, yeah, that Christian stuff, don't believe that.
If we keep making our kids little Marxists, eventually they're going to take over the government, and then we're going to be in serious trouble.
We, as educators or parents or students, need to know that you're living in a dark age of the mind. It's no longer pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness. It pursues sex studies, just the basest things that Romans 1 talks about, instead of what is good, true, and beautiful.
Now, in the first clip I showed as well from this interview, Dr. Owen Anderson, he talks about how universities, they're targeting, quote unquote, secular universities are targeting Christians and Christianity. They hate Christianity, he said. And he says that students and parents will realize eventually that the students have learned nothing at university and they'll all demand their money back. This idea that all public institutions are evil that they are opposed to Christianity, that they have a conspiracy to destroy the faith of Christians is just a bizarre far-right conspiracy theory. And I noted that in the previous video. What I didn't really recognize at the time is how closely this rhetoric aligns with J.D. Vance, the Donald Trump's running mate for the vice presidency, how much this rhetoric aligns with his attacks on the public universities. Vance has been a consistent critic of public education and specifically of universities, arguing that quote unquote secular public universities are cesspools of indoctrination, of far left indoctrination, and he wants to attack them. So here's an example. This is from Rachel Maddow. So just a clip of J.D. Vance talking about public universities in 2021, which is the same rhetoric he's using on the campaign trail now. And as you listen to it, consider how closely this aligns with Turek and his guest Owen Anderson on his recent podcast.
I think if any of us want to do the things that we want to do for our country and for the people who live in it, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, the universities do not pursue knowledge and truth. They pursue deceit and lies, and it's time to be honest about that fact. Of course, I imagine that I don't have to convince any of you that this is preposterous, that the universities in our country are fundamentally corrupt and dedicated to deceit and lies. Our universities are so committed to some of the most preposterous dishonesties in the world.
J.D. Vance is now the Republican nominee for vice president of the.
Maddow notes that the title of Vance's speech at the time was, quote, "The universities are the enemy," which is very much aligns with Frank Turek's view. Now, the last clip I want to show is just from a most recent clip where Turek posted of an interview he did with another gentleman. Here, he introduces this with a tweet saying, "Are borders biblical? Could far left politics be benefiting from localized terrorism? Discover the answers in my recent YouTube live stream with historian Bill Federer, The Shocking History of Open Borders." And I'm going to play one clip where Federer, from this promotional video, where Federer offers his views on the nature of government.
There's no command for the government to take care of the poor. The command to the government is the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in healthcare. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. So that brings up another issue: is that would it be beneficial to a particular party to have terrorism take place in the cities? And so if you remember, one of the things I noticed when I wrote my book on socialism is you have to have crises to get people to panic so they give up their freedom to the government.
Now, I agree with one thing Federer says there at the end is that governments do use crises to expand their power. I mean, look in the wake of 9/11 and the implementation of the Patriot Act, which limited civil rights for people. Naomi Klein talks about this process at length, extensively in her book, The Shock Doctrine, where she talks about how crisis brings about radical free market reforms that benefit the rich. So, I mean, I agree with that part, that little bit, but nothing else. What the clip doesn't explain, and I'm not going to watch the full live stream, I'm sorry, I don't have the time or the energy or the inclination to do so, but it doesn't explain what Federer is saying in terms of the command for government to do this, if he's talking about the Bible or the Constitution or what. What is clear and what is shocking is that he says, in his view, education and healthcare should not be covered by the government, but by the church. This is, I mean, the pretty radical version of Christian nationalism here. The idea that education, public education, should be controlled by the church, that healthcare should be controlled by the church. What would that even look like? I don't have a clue, but I don't want to find out. What is clear, however, is that Once again, Frank Turek is promoting far right rhetoric, which is MAGA rhetoric, which is merged now with Christian nationalism. And that is the new face increasingly of conservative Christian apologetics. And it should worry everybody, because that is less about defending the gospel and Christianity than it is about defending a syncretism between this far right understanding of Christianity with a distorted version of the Republican Party platform, which is centered on the personality cult of Donald Trump.